Married, divorced, and single here, it's one family that mingles here.
Conservative and liberal here, we've all got to give a little here.
Big and small here, there's room for us all here. Doubt and belief here, we all can receive here.
LGBTQ and straight here, there is no hate here.
Woman and man here, everyone can here. Whatever your race here, for all of us grace here.
In imitation of the ridiculous love Almighty God has for each of us and all of us, let us live and love without labels.
Paula was sharing with me, I think about a month ago when we talked, and she said, hey, would you consider coming and sharing the left hand? She was talking a little bit about where you guys have been going in the teaching, and I know you've been talking about this idea about the third arrival of love, and that we, God's people, are the third arrival of love in the world. And I'll admit that a month ago, I had other things in my mind. I mean, we're always thinking about love, right? But really, at some point, there was other things, and I kind of thought, where should I go with this teaching? And then a lot has unfolded in my life in the last month, particularly in the last couple of weeks, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But I'm excited to kind of pick up with that theme with you all this evening. So with that, if you have a Bible, maybe I think you guys kind of do the verse up here. So I'm going to look at a really popular passage, a passage that if you have been around the church, actually you don't have to have been in the church, you've probably heard of the passage called the Good Samaritan. It's a story that Jesus tells. And so I actually want to look at that passage this evening, and so I'm going to turn to it. It's in Luke chapter 10, and I'm going to read a little bit here, and then we'll chat. So Luke chapter 10, beginning in verse 25 through verse 29. It says, on one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus said, what is written in the law? And he replied, how do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your strength, with all of your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus responded, you have answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this, and you will live. But he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus further, and who is my neighbor? Now, many of you probably have heard this passage many a time before. And I think oftentimes when we turn to one of these passages where Jesus is speaking to like a Pharisee or one of these teachers of the law. In this case, this man was a lawyer at his time. So this man was very well educated. He would have known the Torah, the original Jewish teachings. He would have known it back and forth. He would have memorized large portions of it. And we know that this man was sort of coming to Jesus, this new kind of hip, in vogue rabbi, and he's saying to him, let's see what this guy's made of. So he's bringing him a question. And he says to him, teacher, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? So basically, what's the most important thing we need to do before God? What's the most important thing in this world? And Jesus throws it back on him. He says, well, what do you think? And he says, we need to obey the law. And he said, well, how do you read it? And he answers correctly, this lawyer, and basically quotes the central passage that Jesus otherwise had said is the most important passage of all the teaching. He says in another place in the Gospels that this idea of loving the Lord your God with everything that you are and loving your neighbor as yourself is basically sums up all of the teachings of the law and the prophets. This man answered correctly. Now, the man could have stayed here, right? He could have just left it there and gone, well, score. Like I won some credit with the rabbi, right? But we're told that he wanted to justify himself. Basically, I think he came at this question honestly, but he said, who's my neighbor? Like, who do I really need to love? And because he wanted to justify himself, I think what he was basically saying here was, who do I need to serve and who can I ignore? Who are the people that I need to actually care about? Because really, if I were to love if everyone's my neighbor, that's a pretty hard task, right? If people I don't like are my neighbor, that's an even harder task. What does it mean to live out this command? I think he comes to it honestly. And oftentimes we want to demonize these teachers of the law, these Pharisees, these folks who are oftentimes set opposed to Jesus, and we make them bad. But actually what disturbs me about this passage a lot is that, like, I see myself, Dave, in the question that this teacher of the law asked. In this last couple weeks, I've seen myself in this question. Who do I need to serve, and who can I ignore? About 3 weeks ago tonight, I was in Santa Cruz, and I was with some of our pastoral residents. We get this great group of residents that are walking with us for a year with our church staff. They're folks who are discerning whether maybe one day they'd be in full-time ministry, and should they go to seminary. And so we're finishing up our 10-month time with them, this great retreat center in Santa Cruz, with a bunch of other students from across the country. And it got to be late at night. It was a fun time around a campfire. We were sharing our reflections. And you know how scientists and others are telling us now the worst thing you can do is to check your phone at night before you go to bed? Okay, there's more than one reason why you shouldn't check your phone before you go to bed at night. And the reason is I had received a text. And so I was just about to go to bed. It was about 11 at night, and I had an early flight the next day. So I pulled out my phone. I'm in this little cool hip cubby thing, this little, like, it was built into the wall, and there's a bunch of other people there. I'm trying to be quiet. I pulled up my phone, and I got a text from a friend in the city who I haven't talked to for a really long time. And she works with the American Friends Service Committee, and she said, Dave, we have an opportunity to receive 55 asylum seekers from the border here in Denver. And I want to know, would Denver Community Church consider bringing them in and housing them for a few days? Now, you need to understand that 3 weeks ago on Saturday the next day was Mother's Day. And I'm a pastor, okay? Sunday often takes me away from my wife on Mother's Day, but I planned this well. I was surprising her by flying back early in the morning, back to Denver. She thought I was coming in on Sunday night late, but I changed my flight. So I'm about ready. I'm thinking about this morning, or that next morning, I'm going to get up really early in Santa Cruz. I'm going to get on a plane, and I'm going to fly back, and I'm going to surprise my wife because she's at home with the kids, and she thinks that Mother's Day is virtually ruined. And I had cleared this with her a long time ago. So I'm getting this text, and there's a real tension beginning to come up in me because I'm thinking, I have an amazing opportunity here, and I have so much anxiety. So much anxiety. Do you guys know what the God card is? Let me explain. I think you'll know what I'm talking about. The God card oftentimes ruins a lot of junior high and high school dating relationships. It's the God told me to. God oftentimes in Christian circles and religious circles becomes the thing that is like the trump card. That's not a good analogy in light of our culture, but it becomes something that really just, it supersedes everything, right? If you say, God told me X, Y, or Z, it's just a way of not taking responsibility for something, right? This happens in relationships. This happens in all kinds of ways in our culture. Well, as a pastor, you can imagine I can play the God card all the time. But if I want to stay married, you don't play the God card. You actually play the God card very, very selectively, okay? And so what I began to see happening was there was an asylum seeker card emerging here because I had to make a choice. I felt the pressure at that moment to think, what am I going to do here? By checking this text and looking at it, we have the opportunity to house 55 asylum seekers, and the anxiety began to rise in me because I thought, what you don't know is that the 2 weeks prior to this, as a church at Denver Community Church, we gave the previous weeks before that to studying and giving all of our service time to the studying immigration and refugees. And so I'm thinking, like, look what God is doing. It's incredible. Another part of me is like, my wife is going to bury me. So I just decided to close my phone and go to sleep. I slept on it. Because I knew, and I'm not saying this is a good thing, no one knows that I checked my text that night. So I thought, I don't know what to do. I don't know what the right answer is, but I can't answer this now. So I went to bed. I got up the next morning. I got up at 4:30, and I got into an Uber. And that 2-hour Uber ride to the San Jose airport, I was like sweating in the back seat trying to decide how I need to answer this. What do I need to do? And so one thing led to another. I started texting one of my friends back at DCC, and I said, hey, this opportunity came our way. I'm not sure what the right answer is, but I knew if we were going to do something, we had to make a decision before services started next Sunday morning. So I'm texting with my colleague, John. Eventually call him while we're on the runway. I was that guy on the plane while the plane's taxiing, and I'm having a phone call, and he said, yay or nay, yay or nay. My blood pressure's rising, and I said, John, I think we have to do this. Tell everyone at church on Sunday. So service is about to start. I get on the plane. I fly back to Denver. Meanwhile, a few hours later, I arrive at home, and I enter the backyard, and my wife's hanging out with the kids, and I come in, and I surprise her, and I have to look her in the eyes and tell her, sweetie, I wanted to come home to celebrate you and to celebrate this day and make it really special. But the reality is there are 55 asylum seekers on their way to our church right now, and I don't know what to do. Guys, I felt an incredible amount of anxiety. I felt overwhelmed by what was before me. And I think this question was burning in me, and I come to it honestly, much like this lawyer did. Who is my neighbor? Who are we called to serve, and who can we ignore? In that moment, I didn't know what to do. I felt overwhelmed. I felt really justified in actually saying no. I was in California. You didn't give us much of a notice. But I felt like I was supposed to step out in faith. So, with that, what we see here is that Jesus is going to respond to this man. And he's going to respond to him in a way, in his question, in a way that oftentimes we're so used to the story, we read it, and we come to it just like, oh yeah, this is what Jesus said about it. But the more I begin to understand, I've been reflecting on this story the last few weeks, and I see Jesus doing the thing that only Jesus can do here in a unique way. You see, the man that asked that question, he came to that question like I imagine a lot of you do, certainly the way I do. He comes to it as an educated person, as a resource person, as a person who undoubtedly had a lot of power in his world. He was a teacher and a lawyer. He was a wealthy man. He was a very educated man. He was a well-networked person. He was, dare I say, a very privileged person. He comes to the question saying, who do I, someone with power, need to serve, and who can I ignore? That's the way I often come to these questions. So if we ask ourselves, who in the world are we called to serve, and who can we ignore? What Jesus doesn't allow is this man to stay in the place of power. You see, if Jesus was to just answer this man directly, he would have told a story that went something like this. He would have said this. He said, let me tell you a story. A Jew with whom this teacher of the law could have identified comes down the road and finds a man lying in the road, dying in his own blood, robbed of all his possessions, but upon closer look, he sees it is a Samaritan. Now, you need to understand who a Samaritan was. If you don't know, a Samaritan in Jesus' day was known to be a person who was a half-breed. You see, a couple hundred years earlier, the Assyrians had attacked and virtually destroyed Jerusalem. And these Assyrians took most of the men and women and children out of Jerusalem, but they left some behind, these Assyrians. And over generations, they intermarried with the Jews. And so when you look a couple hundred years later in Jesus' time, the Samaritans were these half-breeds. They were folks who had intermarried with Assyrians. And so in Jesus' day, they were seen as the other. They weren't just people we didn't identify with or didn't like, but because they taught different things about the Bible and the Torah. They had different understandings about the law. For this man, a teacher of the law, a Jew, a Samaritan, was an enemy of God. He had every right in his bones to think that a Samaritan was absolutely someone that he could ignore in every way. And so if I was telling a story, when he came upon a Samaritan, Jesus would then challenge him and say, this Jew, he came down from his animal, bandaged up the Samaritan's wounds, and took him to safety. Now he would have said to the expert in the law, there's your answer. Who's your neighbor, you may ask? Why, even an enemy like a Samaritan is your neighbor if he is in need. Now, I doubt the lawyer would have been moved at all by the story, because this is the story I would have told him. This story leaves that Jewish man in the place of power, in the place of privilege, as the one who's called to serve. He said, if I came upon a dying Samaritan, I would ride over him and finish him off. What a ridiculous story. What Jew with any integrity would act in such a foolish way? You see, if Jesus would have answered his question, the way that the man brought his question from a place of power and privilege, there would be no really good way for this man to understand what the point of Jesus' story. But Jesus, as he often does, flips the script. Not the story I would tell, not the story perhaps we would tell, but he tells a better story. Let's look at the text. The story Jesus tells does not leave the man in a place of power. Jesus replied to him, "Who's your neighbor?" In verse 30 it says, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was then attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, went away, and left him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side." Notice the priest is someone that this Jewish man could have identified with. "So too then a Levite, when he came to a place and saw him, he passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged up his wounds, poured oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn to take care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. 'Look after him,' he said, 'and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expenses you may have.' Then Jesus asked him, 'Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?' The expert in the law replied, 'The one who had mercy on him.' And Jesus told him, 'Go and do likewise.'" You see, if Jesus would have told the story that I told, the story that perhaps many of us would have told, it would have left this man in a place of power. But by flipping the script, Jesus puts this lawyer in the place of the victim. You see, the one he could identify with was the Jew who was beat up along the road and abused along the way. And he forced him to consider a story in which a priest and a Levite, someone he would have been able to network with, someone that he hoped would see him in his need, they passed by, but his very enemy is the one who shows mercy. Jesus forces this powerful man, this wealthy man, this well-educated man, to stand in the very shoes of the victim. And that's what Jesus does every single time, isn't it? You see, there's a saying that we have in our culture. It's called the golden rule, right? We all know the golden rule. It comes from Luke 6:31. This is so ubiquitous and so understood and so assumed in our culture, a lot of us don't even know this comes from the Bible. But what a scandalous teaching. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's a nice teaching. It belongs like on a refrigerator magnet or it's like a crochet on the wall, right? And maybe a bumper sticker. What a scandalous teaching. What a scandalous idea. And perhaps in our world today, so divided, so polarized, so much hate and misunderstanding toward the other, maybe there's not a teaching we need more than that. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You see, oftentimes, me as an educated person, as a religious person, as a white male with money and power, who's tall, we all bring different things to the table, you know? And the ways that I continually find Jesus working in my heart is actually taking me out of my shoes and putting me into the shoes of the other. Someone who's not like me, someone who doesn't think like me, someone who doesn't look like me. Always, time and time again, that's the way God's working in my heart, is picking me up out of my place, my perspective, the way I see the world, and putting me in the shoes of the other. And here Jesus is doing it again. Perhaps maybe the most scandalous thing we can do in our world today is to be in the place of those who are marginalized, who are othered, and who are outside, to get into their shoes a little bit. One of my favorite authors and honestly just workers and activists is a man named Greg Boyle. Does anyone know who Greg Boyle is? Father Greg Boyle is a Jesuit priest in East LA, in St. Dolores Mission. For 30 years he's been serving there, and he started the world's largest gang rehabilitation program called Homeboy Industries. And he gives a job to mostly Chicano men and women whose lives have been entangled with gangs, from broken families and generations of poverty. And he does the simplest thing he could do. The Homeboy Industries works to give them a job, but they give them a family that transcends the family of the gang that many of them have come from, or the broken home they never knew, or the family they never knew because of their broken homes. And Greg Boyle talks a lot about how do we serve the other in our lives. And he always says that the ball, or the first place that many of us start is service. Much like this teacher of the law. Who do I need to serve? It starts with service. He says that's the hallway. But the ballroom of true relationship is what we call kinship and family. Oftentimes service is just the hallway that gets us to what God often wants to see in us and through us, which is kinship, which means mutuality and identification with the other. It's not saying I need to serve someone just because it's the right thing to do, or it's the first step, it's the thing that I'm commanded to do, to love other people. But I only truly love when I see myself in their shoes. After that phone call and that trip back to Denver and that hard conversation with my wife, the most amazing thing unfolded in the next 15 hours, both in our community and around Denver. Because not only did our community respond to the need to help host and give shelter to and homes to and short-term food and help to these asylum seekers, but people who have never stepped foot in the church came out of the woodwork to show up, so desperate to serve. And my wife, as much as she was a little bummed that we weren't going to spend the afternoon together, she said, on Mother's Day, of all days, if there are kids without a home, if there are families and mothers who have walked across Mexico, right, from Central America for more than a month, and they're coming in a van and they need shelter, there's nothing more motherly than we could do on Mother's Day. That evening, 3 a.m. the next day, so it would have been May 13th, the night after Mother's Day, that morning. After 15 hours of mobilizing, at 3 a.m. a bus rolled in front of our church, and 55 asylum seekers who literally had walked across Mexico, most of them traveling for more than a month, men, women, and a lot of kids, piled off this bus, blurry-eyed from a 12-hour ride from the border, and walked into our building. And the first person I saw get off the bus was a dad who was about my age. He had one of his sons in his arms, another one in his hand, make really similar ages to my own son. And I didn't see a victim. I didn't see a Latin American refugee who had broken a law. All I could see was me. All I could see was me. The next several days, we helped feed, we helped clothe, create a warm, inviting environment. Folks came from all kinds of places. Illegal Pete's, the real Illegal Pete, wrote and sent burritos. Jimmy John sent sandwiches. The governor called. Everyone showed up. Everyone showed up. Greg Boyle says it this way. I love this quote. He says, the strategy of Jesus is not centered in taking the right stand on issues, but rather standing in the right place with the outcast and those relegated to the margins. I love that. Not taking the right stand, but standing at the right place. That's the difference between having opinions and holding people at arm's length and getting close and getting in their shoes. A couple days later, I received an email from a woman that I had been working with, and I didn't know her story. In her email, and I'll end with this. In her email, she talked about how she hadn't been in church for over a decade because of the pain of what the church had done to her family. Her dad had been a pastor before, and her family had fallen apart, and she had basically been held the church at arm's length. But when she heard about the asylum seekers, she said it was the first time that she was willing to go into a church that week, not a Sunday service, but into our ballroom, into the area where we were serving refugees. And she talked about the trepidation of even walking into church and how hard that was for her. But then she wrote me this, and I wanted to read it to you. She was bilingual, and she spent time with a lot of the refugees, and she said this: I was overcome with emotion after interviewing the family. He said, I forgot to mention something that was said by one of the men during the interview. It might be worth passing this along to your staff and congregation. When asked what this experience had been like here, he said, we've never encountered a place like this. They've treated us like royalty here. We are forever grateful. And she said, thank you for your openness and willingness to jump into the unknown this past week. It was humbling to be a part of. Each one of the people I interviewed said it was the first time they were able to wash their face, rest, and feel safe in weeks. We know the journey will continue to be hard, but what a beautiful gift. Having received that email and talking to this young woman and seeing that father and being intimate with my own anxiety and fear in my life, began to see that when we're standing in the right place, everyone gets healed. Me and my anxiety, the father and the countless others who didn't know where they were going to put their head down on the pillow that night, how they were going to feed their kids, or could they even come into our country. And Kristen, who stepped into a church again for the first time. When we're standing in the right place, everyone gets healed.
Thanks again for watching today's sermon at Left Hand Church. If you live in Colorado and would like to attend, we meet on Saturdays at 5 o'clock. If you'd like to contribute to Left Hand Church, go to lefthandchurch.org/give. And if you'd like to send us a confidential prayer request, you can send it to prayer@lefthandchurch.org. Thanks again for watching.